I recently spoke to Brian Jaffe, the CEO of Bidvest, and asked him his personal opinion on whether the euro is a viable currency going forward, and he doesn't think so. Certainly what is being thrown out there is, can you have monetary union without political union? And it would be good to get your views on that point.
In reality, you do have monetary union, you do have a framework of agreement and the rules that are in place, and a very fragile and tenuous recovery. You know, if you look at European growth, is expected to stay at around 1% for the foreseeable future. So I don't think it's about asking whether it's a viable currency. The question for me is, how do you resolve some of these issues in the interest of greater stability?
But you do believe they will be resolved ultimately?
I think that you've got very wise people around the table and huge challenges. They have to be resolved. In what way they get resolved is going to determine what happens to many of us, because don't forget, a country like us is dependent on what happens, our growth is dependent on what happens on world growth. So I don't think we should be looking at it to pick it apart. I think we should be looking at it and recognize the huge reluctance of the German taxpayer to come to the party.
There's also the sentiment out there that government debt could cause a double-dip recession globally.
Not just government debt. I think there are real issues that all the countries are facing, and we're certainly not clear of the problems. This is something that, it's work in progress. There's no way anyone can with certainty say it's not going to happen. What you're looking at is everybody's trying to work on what we know and what we can do to avoid it. And I think that is the measure that one should be looking at, is what is being done by governments, by central banks, through the coordination, to see what it is that you can put a floor. I mean, it's this action that's created a floor to what is known now as the Great Recession rather than a second depression. And it's that working through the issues to see what are the measures that need to be taken to try to avoid that happening. And I think the fact that we are seeing revised numbers up is very positive, but I don't think anyone would be able to say for certain that this wouldn't happen. What is clear, it's going to be very hard. It's going to be hard for much longer than people experience and expect, and that there are very big consequences. One of the biggest in all of our countries, South Africa included, is what this recession has done in terms of employment. You know, most levels, Europe, a little below 10%, around 8, just below 8, just above 8, a little bit to 9, but a very different response to employment in Europe and the UK compared to the US. The US just below 10% unemployment. On the narrow measure, broader measure, just below 18%. They are having growth, but it's not jobs growing with jobs. So does this become a structural problem with all its consequences? If you look at Europe, they've had a different approach of labor hoarding. Now, if this continues at a slow pace of recovery for longer, can they retain that, or do we have a lagged effect to employment? These are huge challenges.
Goldman Sachs, when you read those headlines that Goldman Sachs is being charged with fraud by the Securities Exchange Commission, how does that make you feel about financial institutions? Could this be the second leg of a financial crisis? Are there many more skeletons to come out of the closet, so to speak?
I think it really does ask for a rethink. I mean, certainly, let's put it this way. There's a lot of measures being taken around regulation and discussion taking place about what is appropriate for size, for interconnectedness, for the weight that you have as an investment bank, a difference between the investment bank and the retail banks. There's not a clear answer at this point in time. Lots of questions. And if you look at the regulatory steps that are being considered at the moment, they're out for discussion. There's got to be impact assessment on them. It relates to higher capital buffers. It relates to leverage, the size of leverage that is taking place in these institutions, and so on. So I think very important questions being asked. Does it make me concerned? Yes, because in the end, you need banks to function. Part of the issue of the length of crises does depend on whether you've had a banking crisis with your crisis or not. Because to get your banking system working again makes it last much longer. If you look at some of the research being done, if there's been a banking crisis, it's much harder to recover. So you do, if you look at credit extension all over, it's very low. So you need to get your banking system working again. But you also need to have trust in the banks. And you need to have trust in the banks. They've got to behave ethically, and you've got to have confidence that they are acting in an appropriate way. And you need a regulatory environment that enables that confidence to be rebuilt. So I think of great concern that this has occurred, and therefore a need to step up both the regulatory measures that are in place, which are, as I said, already being considered by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, but also the question of how do you get a rebuild of confidence and trust and ethics into the system, and that's hugely difficult.
That also begs the question whether the US banks decide, despite the profits that we're seeing coming to the table at the moment, which are shooting the lights out on a number of aspects, whether US banks are actually lending or whether they are just making money from fixed income investments. They're borrowing at 0 interest rates and they're deploying that money into long-term treasuries at 4%. I mean, it's a no-brainer they're going to make money, but the bigger question is whether that trust can be brought back to the consumer and if they're lending to the consumer.
Well, I think, you've got to draw the distinction between the investment banks and the retail banks. I think you'll find that the traditional high street or lending banks are still battling. They're not the ones, the side of the banks that are making the money. They're the ones that still have the higher provisioning for losses, the question of defaults, all of that is still being affected on the retail side. You must also remember is that as you're getting to this recovery and you're reworking what needs to be done with the banks, there's a huge demand for capital raising. And who does it? The very banks themselves. So, they're the ones who are engaging in the markets, and therefore there are fewer of them as a result. The need is huge because you're having to recapitalize. So they are making a lot of money, and therefore there has been the steps and the discussions around, do you have a banking tax? How do you deal with this windfall, which in my view should be part and parcel of a reimbursement to the system, because it's the system that's had to carry it. How do you get trust back? Well, part of it is accountability, transparency, and it's going to be a long haul. I think it's going to be a long haul to get trust back, especially at that level.